Of all the stories in this book, I think this next one is my favorite. When I first read this book, it was a long time ago, like 20 years ago. But this story stuck in my mind, and I've thought about it often since the first time that I read it. It's called The Old Woman Who Wanted All the Cakes. There was once a little cottage on the edge of the wood. In it, a little old woman lived all by herself. One day she said to herself, "I will bake some sweet cakes for my dinner." She put on a fresh white apron to keep her nice black dress clean. Over her head, she pulled a little red cap to keep her hair tidy. It was chilly in the kitchen, so she threw a little white cape around her shoulders. Then the little old woman was all ready to make her cakes. She took a blue bowl down from the shelf. In it, she put eggs from the cupboard, sugar from the bucket, milk from the pan, flour from the barrel, and raisins from the jar. She mixed up all these good things. Then she rolled out the dough and popped a pan full of cakes into the oven. They came out nice and brown and sweet smelling. A poor old man was passing by. The cakes smelled good to him, for he was very hungry. He looked in at the door of the cottage and said to the old woman, "Won't you please give me one of your good cakes? I am very hungry." The old woman said, "I will bake one cake for you. I cannot give you one of these." She cut off a tiny piece of dough. She rolled it and rolled it with a rolling pin. Then she patted and patted it with her hands and shaped it into a tiny cake. Then something very strange happened. The tiny cake began to grow bigger and bigger. "I cannot give you this cake," said the woman to the poor old man. "It is much too big. I will make you a smaller one." Then she put the cake into the oven and baked it for herself. She took another piece of dough, smaller than the first piece. She rolled it and rolled it with a rolling pin. She patted and patted it with her hands and shaped it into a very tiny cake. Again, something strange happened. The tiny cake began to grow bigger and bigger. "I cannot give you this cake," said the little old woman to the little old man. "It is much too big. I will make you an even smaller one." She put the cake into the oven and baked it for herself. Then she took a tiny scrap of dough, no bigger than a grain of wheat. She rolled it and rolled it with her rolling pin. Then she patted and patted it with her hands and shaped it into the tiniest of cakes. Then, strangely enough, this tiny, tiny cake began to grow bigger and bigger. "I cannot give you any cake at all," said the little old woman to the old man. "These cakes are all too big to give away. I want them all myself." The poor old man looked very sad. He turned and went away, as hungry as before. "Now," said the old woman, "I can have a good time eating all the cakes myself." So she sat down at the table and began to eat her cakes. Then something very strange began to happen to the little old woman. She began to grow smaller and smaller. She touched her nose. It was hard and sharp. It had changed into a beak. She looked down at her hands. They had changed into wings. She looked at her feet. They had changed into claws. She still wore her little red cap on her head. She still wore her black dress and her little white cape and her white apron. But they had all changed into feathers. She wasn't a little old woman at all. She had changed into a bird. Someday, if you go into the woods, you will see her hopping up and down the trunk of trees. She's always hungry and is looking for something to eat. She has to work hard for her food. She sticks her long, sharp beak into the bark of the tree. Tap, tap, tap. You can hear her pecking a long way off. She hopes she may find a fat beetle for her supper. She still wears her black dress, her white apron, her little white cape, and her little red cap. But they are all made of feathers. You must have guessed who she is by this time. The selfish old woman was changed into a woodpecker. I think there's a lot of reasons why I like that story. It's good, right? I like it myself because I like birds. And I see woodpeckers. So every time I see a woodpecker, I'm reminded of that story again and how good a description it is of an actual woodpecker. But I also like to think about it. It's about sharing, isn't it? And oddly, the more the woman had, the less she wanted to share. That can happen. There's a word for that. It's called being greedy. So, like these other folk tales, in which good is rewarded, or in this case, bad is punished, it gives us something to think about in terms of what's the right way to be. What kind of person do we want to be? Certainly, we don't want to be the woodpecker.